She was abandoned on a blind date with no money. The Mafia boss sitting close couldn't look away. Before we dive into the story, tell me where in the world you're watching from, and if this story steals your heart, please hit subscribe. The silence in Belanicos was a weapon. It was thick and heavy, pressing down on Felicia Gallo from all sides, a physical weight of judgment. Every clink of silverware, every hushed murmur from the surrounding tables, felt like a fresh cut against her exposed nerves. Her blind date, Ben, had been gone for 10 minutes, but the ghost of his sneering voice still hung in the air. "You seriously thought you could afford a place like this?" He had scoffed, his face a mask of theatrical disbelief when she admitted her wallet contained less than $40. He had stood, tossed his napkin onto his half-eaten plate of lobster, and walked away, leaving her stranded in a sea of starched white linen and crystal glasses. The bill, folded discreetly in a leather folio on the table, felt as heavy as a gravestone. Her face burned with a shame so hot it felt like a fever, a desperate heat that prickled behind her eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on the intricate scrollwork of the fork beside her plate, her hands trembling in her lap, clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. From a shadowed table in the corner, Emmett Lyon watched. He had been conducting a quiet, tense negotiation with a shipping magnate, a discussion that involved millions of dollars and the subtle threat of force that always underscored his business dealings. But the conversation had faded into a dull drone in his ears the moment the scene at her table had begun to unravel. He had noticed her when she walked in, a quiet grace about her that seemed out of place among the city's elite who frequented the restaurant. There was a carefulness in her movements, a fragility that was belied by the stubborn set of her jaw. He watched Ben's casual cruelty, a pathetic display of masculine inadequacy, and then he watched her. She didn't crumble. She froze, her posture becoming a rigid monument to humiliation. Guests whispered, their eyes flicking toward her with the kind of morbid curiosity reserved for roadside accidents. The waiters, once obsequious, now hovered with predatory patience, their frowns deepening. Something inside Emmett, a long-dormant and heavily guarded instinct, stirred. It was not pity. It was a cold, sharp recognition. In her trembling stillness, he saw a core of unbreakable steel. He was not supposed to get involved. His life was a fortress built of discretion and control, and this woman was a stranger, a complete unknown. Yet, he could not look away. The restaurant manager, a man with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes, began to make his way toward her table, his steps deliberate and ominous. That was the moment. The decision was made in the space of a single heartbeat. Emmett placed his napkin on the table, a silent signal to his associate that their meeting was over. He rose to his feet, a tall, imposing figure in a perfectly tailored dark suit. His movement commanded immediate attention. A hush fell over the room as every eye turned to him. The whispers died. The waiters froze. The manager stopped dead in his tracks, his professional smile faltering into a look of pure, unadulterated shock. Emmett Lyon was a name spoken in careful tones in the city, the head of an empire whose foundations were as deep and dark as the river that ran through the metropolis. His presence in a room changed its entire chemistry. When he moved with purpose, everyone held their breath. He walked toward her table, his steps unhurried, his expression unreadable. Felicia finally looked up, her gaze drawn by the sudden, suffocating silence. Her eyes, a deep, troubled brown, met his. In them, he saw fear, shame, and a spark of defiant fury that sealed his resolve. He stopped beside her chair, his shadow falling over her. He ignored her completely for a moment, his cold, gray eyes pinning the manager to the spot. "Is there a problem here?" Emmett's voice was quiet, a low baritone that carried more menace than a shout ever could. The manager swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Mr. Lyon, no, sir, not at all. This lady's companion left without settling the bill." Emmett's gaze flickered to Felicia, a brief, assessing glance before returning to the manager. "That man," he said, the words clipped and precise, "was not her companion. He was a rude acquaintance who interrupted our evening. She was waiting for me." A lie clean and sharp as a shard of glass sliced through the tension in the room. It was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable, yet delivered with such absolute authority that no one dared to question it. He reached into his jacket, produced a black credit card, and handed it to the stunned manager. "Add her bill to my own. And bring a bottle of the Cheval Blanc to my table. My guest and I have been delayed long enough." He then turned his full attention to Felicia, who was staring at him, her lips parted in disbelief. "I apologize for being late," he said to her, his voice softening just enough to be for her alone. "Shall we?" He extended a hand, not to help her up, but as an undeniable command. The choice was not a choice at all. It was ruin or him. Her hand, still trembling slightly, rose to meet his. The moment his skin touched hers, a jolt, electric and warm, shot through her. Everyone in the restaurant knew what they were witnessing. Once Emmett Lyon chose someone, claimed them in such a public way, they were his. The entire room knew she now belonged to the Mafia boss. The air outside the restaurant was cool against Felicia's heated skin, but it did nothing to calm the frantic beating of her heart. Emmett Lyon's hand was a firm, steady presence at the small of her back, guiding her away from the golden light of the entrance and toward a sleek, black sedan idling silently at the curb. A man in a dark suit, built like a fortress, immediately opened the rear door. Emmett did not release her until she was seated inside, the door closing with a heavy, final thud that seemed to sever her from the world she knew. He slid in beside her, and the opulent scent of leather and something else, something uniquely him, a clean, masculine scent of wool and cold night air, filled the small space. The car pulled away from the curb with a smooth, powerful glide, plunging them into the river of city lights. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. Felicia stared out the window, watching the glittering skyscrapers blur past, her mind racing to catch up with the sheer surreality of the last half hour. She was in a stranger's car, a man who had lied for her, paid for her, and claimed her in front of a room full of people as if he had every right in the world. "You should know," she finally said, her voice steadier than she felt, "that I have no way of paying you back for that." She turned to look at him. In the dim, shifting light of the car's interior, his face was all sharp angles and shadows, his expression impassive. "I am aware," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "I saw your date's performance, and I saw your wallet when you opened it to check." The observation was so precise, so invasive, that it made her flinch. He had not just seen her humiliation, he had studied it. "Why would you do that?" she asked, a thread of accusation in her tone. "Interfere like that? Lie for a complete stranger?" He turned his head slowly, and his gray eyes, which seemed to capture and hold the passing lights, met hers. "Let us call it an investment in a moment of integrity," he said. "You were prepared to face the consequences, however unpleasant. You did not beg or make a scene. You simply endured. That is a rare quality." The compliment felt less like a kindness and more like an assessment, as if he were analyzing a piece of art or a potential business acquisition. Felicia bristled. "I don't need your investment or your charity." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "Good, because I am not offering charity." The car turned into a private, gated drive, ascending a long, winding road flanked by old, imposing trees. They were leaving the city behind, heading toward the dark, quiet hills that overlooked the metropolis. A sense of unease, cold and sharp, began to prickle at her. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her hand instinctively going to the door handle. "To make you an offer," he said calmly, his gaze unwavering. "One that is not charity but a business proposition." The car came to a stop before a sprawling modern mansion, a masterpiece of glass and dark stone that seemed to grow out of the hillside itself. The driver opened her door, and she had no choice but to step out into the crisp night air. Emmett led her inside, not into a lavish living area, but down a quiet, minimalist hallway to a large, climate-controlled room that felt more like a private museum vault than a part of a home. The walls were lined with paintings, each one a masterpiece she recognized from art history textbooks. Old masters, Renaissance portraits, Impressionist landscapes. It was a breathtaking, priceless collection. He stopped before a large canvas covered by a protective cloth. "My father acquired this about 30 years ago," he said, his voice taking on a different timbre, one of reverence and old pain. He carefully pulled back the cloth. It was a portrait by a lesser-known Florentine master, a contemporary of Botticelli. A woman with an enigmatic smile stared out from the canvas, but her beauty was marred by a long, jagged tear that ran from the top corner down through her face, and the bottom of the painting was severely damaged by what looked like water or mold. "It was damaged in a fire, years ago. Experts have told me it is beyond repair. They say any attempt to restore it would ruin what remains." Felicia stepped closer, her professional instincts overriding her fear. She ran her eyes over the cracked paint, the darkened varnish, the delicate craquelure. She could see the ghost of the original masterpiece beneath the damage. "They're wrong," she said, her voice soft but certain. "It would take time, immense care, but it can be saved." He turned to her, a flicker of something she couldn't name, surprise, perhaps respect in his eyes. "I know who you are, Felicia Gallo," he said, and her blood ran cold. "You are one of the most promising young conservators in this country, trained at the Florence Academy. You specialize in Florentine art. You also have a mountain of debt, thanks to your former fiancé, Marcus Thorne, who used your name to secure loans he never intended to repay. Your studio went under. You now work part-time cataloging archives for the City Museum for a pittance." He knew everything. The realization was terrifying. Her life, her failures, her secrets, he had laid them all bare. "I am offering you a position," he continued, his tone all business now. "Restore this painting. I will provide you with a fully equipped studio here on the estate. You will live here. All your needs will be met. And I will pay you a salary that will not only clear your debts, but will ensure you never have to worry about money again." It was a lifeline. It was a golden cage. He was offering her freedom, but the price was to place herself entirely in his hands, in his world, a world she could already feel was filled with unspoken rules and hidden dangers. The estate was silent and isolated. The staff moved with a quiet deference that spoke of fear as much as respect, and the man before her exuded an aura of absolute, lethal control. She was trading one kind of prison for another, a prison of poverty for one of opulence and obligation. But she thought of the eviction notice on her apartment door, of the constant, gnawing anxiety of her debt, of the humiliation she had felt in that restaurant. What choice did she really have? She looked from the ruined painting, a thing of beauty that deserved to be saved, to the man who was offering her the chance to do it. The temptation was overwhelming, a siren song promising salvation. "I accept," she said, the words feeling momentous, as if she were signing a contract with a force far older and more powerful than she could comprehend. He simply nodded, a look of quiet satisfaction on his face. He had made his move, asserted his protection, and she had walked willingly into his world. The temptation had been too great to resist. Life on Emmett Lyon's estate was a study in profound contradictions. Felicia was given a suite of rooms that were larger than her entire previous apartment, with windows that overlooked a meticulously manicured garden and the distant, sprawling lights of the city below. The attached studio was a conservator's dream, equipped with the finest tools and technologies, from digital microscopes to custom-mixed solvents. She was a guest, an employee, yet she was also, in a way she could not quite define, a prisoner. She was free to roam the house and grounds, but the perimeter was patrolled by silent, watchful men in dark suits, and she knew without being told that she could not leave without Emmett's permission. Her days fell into a rhythm dictated by the delicate, painstaking work of restoring the Florentine portrait. She spent hours on her feet, her focus narrowed to a tiny square of damaged canvas, carefully cleaning away centuries of grime or meticulously reweaving torn fibers. The work was a solace, a familiar harbor in the strange, unsettling sea of her new reality. It was the only part of her life where she felt completely in control. Emmett himself was a ghost in the architecture of her days. He would be gone before she woke, his business in the city a mysterious and all-consuming affair. But he would return in the evenings, and his presence would shift the atmosphere of the entire house, charging it with a quiet, intense energy. Sometimes he would appear in the doorway of her studio, watching her work in silence for long stretches. He never offered critique or praise, but his gaze was so focused, so penetrating, that she felt as though he were seeing not just the work of her hands, but the very marrow of her bones. During those moments, the professional boundary she tried so desperately to maintain would fray at the edges. She would feel the pull of his presence, a magnetic force that was both frightening and exhilarating. He was her employer, her savior, but the memory of his hand on her back, the low timbre of his voice as he lied for her, the way he looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve, all of it combined to create a dangerous and undeniable attraction. One evening, he brought 2 glasses and a bottle of wine into the studio. "You have been working for 12 hours, he stated, not as a question but as a fact. "You need to stop." Felicia straightened up from her work table, her back aching from being hunched over for so long. I'm close to stabilizing the entire canvas, she protested, though her body betrayed her with a weary sigh. It can wait until tomorrow, he said, pouring the deep red liquid into the glasses. He handed one to her. This is from a vineyard my family has owned in Sicily for 200 years. She took the glass, her fingers brushing against his. The brief contact sent a familiar jolt through her, a warmth that spread up her arm and settled in her chest. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sounds the faint hum of the climate control system and the distant chirp of crickets outside. Why is this painting so important to you? She asked, her curiosity finally winning out over her caution. His expression tightened almost imperceptibly. It was my mother's favorite, he said, his voice flat. The fire, it happened shortly before she passed away. She always regretted that it was never restored. It was the first piece of his personal history he had ever offered her, a small crack in the marble facade of his composure. He spoke of his mother with a kind of bruised reverence that humanized him in a way Felicia found deeply unsettling. It made him more than just the powerful, intimidating figure who controlled her life. It made him a man who had known loss. This glimpse of his vulnerability was more seductive than all the wealth and power that surrounded her. It made her want to know more, to understand the man behind the myth. As the weeks passed, these moments became more frequent. He would join her for dinner in the vast, empty dining room, asking her detailed questions about her work, about the chemical composition of pigments, about the lives of the artists she studied. He was a surprisingly attentive listener, his intelligence sharp and incisive. She, in turn, found herself watching him, studying the way he held his glass, the cold control in his eyes when he took a phone call, the rare, fleeting moments when his guard would drop, and a hint of weariness or regret would shadow his features. She was living in the heart of his empire, and she was beginning to see the man at its center. The temptation she felt was a constant, low-grade fever. It was in the air she breathed, in the silent, knowing glances from his household staff, in the way he would sometimes let his eyes linger on her for a moment too long. She knew what this was, the slow, deliberate seduction of a woman he had, for all intents and purposes, purchased. Yet it felt like more than that. There was a current of genuine curiosity between them, a meeting of two solitary minds. But just as she was beginning to feel a sense of cautious equilibrium, her past came roaring back to reclaim her. She had received special permission from Emmett's head of security to visit a specialty art supply store in the city for materials she couldn't source online. As she was leaving the shop, a voice called her name, a voice that made her blood turn to ice. "Felicia, fancy seeing you here." Marcus Thorne stood before her, his smile as predatory and false as she remembered. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her well-made coat and the expensive leather bag on her shoulder, both gifts from Emmett, insisted upon as part of her compensation. "Looks like you landed on your feet," he said, his tone a slimy mixture of admiration and resentment. "Heard you were living up on Lyon's Mountain. Quite a step up." Fear, cold and absolute, seized her. "Leave me alone, Marcus," she said, trying to push past him. He blocked her path, grabbing her arm. "Not so fast," he hissed, his charming facade dropping away to reveal the viciousness beneath. "After all I did for you, you owe me. The man you're with could buy this entire city. A small finder's fee for the guy who set you on your path seems only fair. Otherwise, I might have to tell your new benefactor all about your past, about the debts, about us." Before she could even respond, two of Emmett's men, who had been shadowing her from a discreet distance, materialized on either side of Marcus. They were silent, their movements economical and brutally efficient. One of them twisted Marcus's arm behind his back, forcing him to release her. The other simply stood in front of him, a mountain of quiet menace. "Is this man bothering you, Ms. Gallo?" one of them asked, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. Felicia, shaken, could only nod. The message came to Emmett in the middle of a board meeting, a single, coded text. He excused himself immediately, his face a mask of cold fury. When Felicia's car arrived back at the estate, he was waiting for her at the entrance. He took one look at her pale, frightened face and his expression became glacial. "Get inside," he ordered her gently, before turning to his head of security. "Tell me what happened." The man relayed the events with dispassionate precision. Emmett listened without interruption, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He said nothing to Felicia about it that evening, a silence that was more terrifying than any outburst. He simply ensured she ate and then retreated to his study. She didn't know what happened to Marcus. She didn't dare to ask, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to her core, that Emmett's response would not be a warning. It would be a solution. Later that night, unable to sleep, she wandered into the library. She found Emmett standing by the fireplace, staring into the flames, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked up as she entered. "He will not bother you again," he said, his voice a low, final statement. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken violence. Felicia wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill running through her. "What did you do?" she whispered. He turned to face her fully, and in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded. "I eliminated a threat to what is mine." The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her, but mixed with it was a fierce, unwavering protectiveness that resonated with a part of her she didn't know existed. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why go to such lengths for me?" He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Because when my father built this empire," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "he was nearly destroyed by a man he trusted as a brother. A man who saw a moment of weakness and tried to take everything. I learned from his mistake. I learned that loyalty is the only thing with value, and that any threat, no matter how small, must be cut out at the root before it can fester." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "I saw you in that restaurant, and I saw someone with a spine of steel, someone who would break before she would bend to dishonor. In my world, that is rarer and more valuable than any painting. I will not allow someone like him to touch you. Ever." In that moment, he was not a CEO or a mafia boss. He was a man revealing a deep and painful wound, a core belief forged in betrayal and violence. He was showing her the reason for his ruthlessness, and in doing so, he was binding her to him with chains forged not of money or obligation, but of a shared, brutal understanding of the world. And as he lowered his head and his lips finally claimed hers, she did not resist. It was no longer just temptation. It was a surrender. The kiss was not gentle. It was a raw, desperate claiming, a release of all the tension that had simmered between them for weeks. It was the taste of expensive whiskey and a deep, possessive hunger that stole the breath from her lungs and left her clinging to him, her fingers digging into the fine wool of his suit jacket. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing heavily, the air in the library thick with unspoken promises and undeniable truths. The wall between them had not just crumbled, it had been utterly demolished. From that night on, everything changed. The polite distance they had maintained vanished, replaced by an intimacy that was as intense and all-consuming as Emmett himself. He was no longer just her protector or employer. He was her lover, and he laid claim to her body, her time, and her thoughts with an unwavering certainty that left no room for doubt. He showed her a side of himself that he kept hidden from the rest of the world, a capacity for tenderness that was shocking in its sincerity. He would trace the curve of her spine as she slept, listen with rapt attention as she spoke passionately about her work, and his eyes, so often cold and calculating, would soften when they looked at her. Their life together settled into a strange domesticity, a quiet island of normalcy in the middle of his dangerous world. They ate their meals together, took walks through the sprawling gardens in the evenings, and spent hours in the library, reading in comfortable silence. He brought her into the heart of his life, and for a while, it was easy for Felicia to forget the true nature of the fortress he had built around them. The restoration of the painting became a metaphor for their relationship. With meticulous care, she was bringing something broken and forgotten back to life, revealing the beauty that had been hidden beneath the scars of the past. Under her skilled hands, the woman in the portrait began to emerge from the darkness, her enigmatic smile seeming to hold a secret that only Felicia now understood. She was healing the canvas, and in turn, she felt herself healing from the wounds Marcus had inflicted on her spirit and her confidence. She was falling in love, deeply and irrevocably, with a man who was both her savior and her captor. But the price of his protection, of his love, soon became terrifyingly clear. His world was not a peaceful one, and his enemies were not content to leave him to his newfound happiness. The first warning was subtle. The brakes on the car that was assigned to her for supply runs were found to have been expertly tampered with, a flaw discovered only during a routine security check. Emmett's fury was a cold, silent storm that swept through his organization. Men were questioned, allegiances were tested, and a new, stricter security protocol was implemented. Felicia was no longer allowed to leave the estate alone. Her trips to the city were curtailed, her communications monitored. The gilded cage was shrinking, its bars becoming more visible. She began to understand that to be loved by Emmett Lyon was to become his single greatest vulnerability. She was the one thing he could not bear to lose, and his enemies, led by a ruthless rival named Petrov, knew it. Petrov was a brutal remnant of the old guard, a man who saw Emmett's polished, corporate approach to the family business as a sign of weakness. He saw Felicia not as a woman, but as a pawn, a key to unlocking and destroying the Lyon Empire. The threats became more direct. A package was delivered to the estate, containing a single dead nightingale, a traditional Sicilian message of betrayal and death. Emmett's face when he saw it was a mask of stone, but Felicia saw the muscle that jumped in his jaw, the murderous rage that blazed in his eyes before he brought it under his iron control. That night, he came to her in her studio, where she was applying the final, delicate layer of varnish to the restored portrait. The woman on the canvas smiled out at them, whole and beautiful once more. "It's finished," Felicia said softly. Emmett barely glanced at it. His eyes were fixed on her. "I want you to have this," he said, pressing a small, heavy object into her hand. It was a key. "It's to a house in Tuscany, near the vineyard my family owns. It is secluded, safe. The deed is in your name. There is an account set up that will provide for you for the rest of your life." Felicia stared at him, her heart sinking. "You're sending me away." It wasn't a question. "I am giving you a choice," he said, his voice strained. "Petrov will not stop. He will use you to get to me. Staying here, the price may be your life." Here it was, the promise and the price laid bare. He was offering her an escape, a future of safety and peace, but it was a future without him. The price of her safety was his love. She thought of her old life, the lonely, anxious struggle for survival. She thought of the humiliation, the fear. Then she looked at Emmett, at this powerful, dangerous, and broken man who had shown her a loyalty so absolute it was terrifying. He had saved her, not just from a restaurant bill, but from the shell of a life she had been living. Loving him was a danger, a constant threat, but a life without him now felt like no life at all. "My choice," she said, her voice trembling but firm as she closed his hand over the key and pushed it back toward him, "is to stay here with you. I am not your weakness, Emmett. Don't you dare treat me like one." A look of profound relief, mingled with a deep, aching sorrow, passed over his face. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "Then I promise you this," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I will burn their world to the ground to keep you safe in mine." The promise was a vow, sealed in the quiet studio, and both of them knew it would be paid for in blood. The fragile peace they had built was shattered less than a week later. Petrov, emboldened by Emmett's refusal to be intimidated, decided to force his hand. The attack was not on the estate, it was too well defended. Instead, he targeted the one place Felicia had a connection to in the outside world, the city archives where she used to work. A fire, deliberately set, ripped through the building overnight. It was a message, cruel and clear: nothing you have ever touched is safe. The news broke Felicia's heart. The loss of historical documents, of irreplaceable records she had spent months cataloging, felt like a personal violation. But for Emmett, it was the final transgression. It was a direct challenge, and more than that, it was an act that had caused her pain. He saw it as an attack on her, and his response was that of a king whose queen had been threatened. The war began. It was not fought in boardrooms or through corporate takeovers. It was a silent, brutal conflict waged in the shadows of the city, in deserted warehouses and on lonely stretches of highway. Emmett moved with the lethal precision of a grandmaster playing a chess game where the pieces were human lives. He dismantled Petrov's operations piece by piece, strangling his supply lines, turning his allies, and sowing seeds of distrust within his organization. Felicia saw the toll it took on him. He grew more distant, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness and the weight of the violence he was commanding. He was a general at war, and the man who had shared quiet moments with her in the library was buried deep beneath layers of cold, ruthless strategy. She felt a growing dread, a fear that the man she loved would be lost forever in the darkness he had unleashed. The reckoning came on a storm-lashed night. Emmett had been lured out to a supposed meeting with one of Petrov's disgruntled lieutenants, a meeting he knew was a trap. He went anyway, taking his best men with him, intending to end the conflict once and for all. It was a feint. While Emmett's forces were engaged across town, Petrov's real target was the estate. His men breached the perimeter in a swift, coordinated assault. The alarms blared through the house, a terrifying scream in the night. Felicia was rushed toward a hidden panic room by two of Emmett's personal guards, but they were ambushed in the hallway. The guards fell, and Felicia found herself face to face with Petrov himself, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "So you are the masterpiece he keeps locked away," Petrov sneered, grabbing her arm. "He will trade his entire kingdom for you." As he dragged her through the house, Felicia's mind raced. Panic gave way to a cold, clear focus, an echo of the survival instinct she had learned from Emmett. She was not a damsel to be bartered. She remembered the layout of the house, the security systems Emmett had once explained to her. As Petrov pulled her past the main security panel near the kitchen, she lunged, slamming her hand against a large red button, the emergency fire suppression override. Halon gas hissed from vents in the ceiling, and thick fire doors began to slide down, sealing off sections of the house. It was chaos. Petrov, caught by surprise, cursed and tightened his grip, but the move had bought time. It had created a disruption. It was the opening Emmett needed. He had anticipated the possibility of a two-pronged attack. A small, elite team had remained hidden on the grounds, and as soon as the house's internal alarms triggered a secondary, silent signal, they moved in. The firefight was short and brutal. Through the thick security glass of a descending fire door, Felicia saw Emmett appear at the end of the hall, his face a mask of terrible rage. He dispatched Petrov's last two men before advancing on Petrov himself, who was still holding Felicia as a shield. There was no negotiation. Emmett raised his weapon, his eyes locked with Felicia's. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. She saw the question in his gaze, a silent request for trust. She knew what she had to do. With all her strength, she drove her elbow back into Petrov's ribs and dropped to the floor. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Petrov crumpled, a look of shock on his face before he fell to the ground, lifeless. Emmett was at her side in an instant, pulling her up, his hands checking her for injuries, his voice a hoarse whisper of her name. He held her tightly, his body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fury. The war was over. In the quiet, hollow aftermath, with the scent of cordite in the air and the flashing lights of his security teams sweeping the grounds, Emmett led her into his study. The violence of the night clung to him like a shroud. He stood before her, the king of a blood-soaked empire, and his eyes were filled with a profound self-loathing. "This is my world, Felicia," he said, his voice raw. "This violence, this death, it will always be a part of me. You can still take the key. You can leave, no one would blame you." He was giving her one last out, a final, true choice. He was offering her freedom, even if it destroyed him. She looked at the man before her, a man who had lied for her, protected her, killed for her. She saw the darkness that swirled within him, but she also saw the unwavering light of his devotion to her. She had chosen him once in her heart. Now she had to choose him with her life. She walked toward him and gently took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "My world was a quiet, desperate place before you found me," she said, her voice clear and strong. "You showed me that loyalty and love are worth fighting for. I am not afraid of your world, Emmett. I am only afraid of one without you in it." A single tear traced a path down his cheek, the only sign of the monumental weight that had just been lifted from his soul. He had fought to keep her, and she had chosen to stay. From that day forward, Emmett Lyon began to reshape his empire. He did not abandon it, but he transformed it. He used the power vacuum left by Petrov's demise to consolidate his control, ruthlessly cutting away the more violent, street-level elements of his business. He poured his energy into Lyon Industries, expanding its legitimate operations, building a fortress of wealth and influence so vast and impenetrable that no one would ever dare to challenge him in the old ways again. He was still a dangerous man, but the violence was now contained, a tool of last resort to protect the calm center of his life. That center was Felicia. The final scene of their story was not one of high drama, but of quiet peace. Months later, Felicia stood in the New City Museum, in a wing funded entirely by an anonymous donation from Lyon Industries. In the place of honor was the restored Florentine portrait, a masterpiece returned to the world. Emmett came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. He was no longer just the Mafia boss or the CEO, he was the man who loved her. They stood together in silence, looking at the painting that had brought them together, a symbol of beauty saved from ruin. Their love had been forged in danger and paid for in blood, but it was real, it was earned, and it was theirs. In the quiet of the museum, surrounded by timeless art, they had found their future, a lasting peace in the heart of their own private, perfect storm.